6, we are told by the scribes, to compel the head of the village of Shamastar in Baalbek to pay a debt of 2 sacks of wheat to the emir. Its purpose, in other words, was to remind a recalcitrant notable of his duties in the socio-economic order of the Muqattaji system. When the brother of the notable in Shamastar received al-Turk's maqāma, he sent the emir the 2 sacks of wheat, thereby satisfying his brother's debt. Such debts, tied to notions of reputation and status, are not purely economic, but also clearly social. The social is the second and deeply intertwined facet of the dialectic between text and world that I wish to explore here. Consider the third maqāma, compiled from lines of poetry composed in the cold winter month of Kanun al-Awwal, or December, in 1811, and therefore entitled al-Qanuniyya. The narrator, al-Hazm, begins as follows, and this is number 1 in your handouts. Here's my translation. The moon of Kanun has appeared, and the time for concealment drawn near. The night is not yet in decline, and men toward their pillows recline. The gathering of brothers is sweet, as is the embrace of friends when they meet, enraptured with a love of late nights, to tear off the gown of boredom and plight. By the troubles of night I was gripped, for of friends and family I was stripped. I had been harmed by my migrations, and lacked companions and neighborly relations. Thinking about this passage as a depiction of social life, albeit one that contains both descriptive and aspirational aspects, we see quite clearly the value of sociality, as well as the suffering of the lonely narrator. As elsewhere in al-Turk's Maqāmāt, here loneliness is connected to place, or rather to being out of place, insofar as a life of travel and migration has isolated the narrator from the pleasures of companionship and community. Yet this maqāma also links sociality to the cycle of the day and the year, in a divergence from the geographic focus of many maqāma collections. Here it is the temporal setting, a winter night, that heightens the loneliness of the wandering narrator. To relieve the burden of his loneliness, the narrator goes off in search of his old friend, Abu Nawadir. He finds him working as a poet in a fictional emir's balat, or court. Exactly like the author himself, Abu Nawadir's job is to praise the winners and mock the losers of their nightly card games. No bets are made, and no money is exchanged. Words and reputation are what is wagered. It should surprise no one, actually, that in the 10 poems, Emir Bashīr is the winner of each and every single card game. Side note. These games are played, we are told by the scribes, to pass the long winter nights in amusement. Here again, it behooves us to think dialectically. A text that describes the loneliness of these winter nights also played a prominent role in combating that very loneliness. In this way, we can grasp the descriptive and agentive dimensions of adab together. The praise poems, composed and performed by al-Turk in the emir's court, and then placed in the mouth of Abu Nawadir, reflect the interpenetration of the social and the economic. 3 of the 10 poems in this maqāma speak of the shame of losing as a dayn, a debt that must be repaid. Here is the 3rd poem, number 2 in your packet, in my translation. Your losses are a heavy debt, so make good the money that you owe. Debt is a disgrace and shame, the best of men neither reap nor sow. Here, adab is clearly part of the circulation of debts and obligations that make a community, not merely a record or representation of that community. In other words, al-Qanuniyya is both a means to describe this community and the substitute currency that holds it together. The maqāma, however, was also a means to regulate social life by expressing dismay at the violation of norms and the disruption of the social order. Take the 6th maqāma, al-Qadiyya, for example, or for instance. It was written in 1807. This is the same year, incidentally, that Niqūlā, Turk's father, is executed. It is written in 1807 when al-Turk learned that some of the younger men in the Emir's court had concocted a rumor that he had become semi-paralyzed in Fallujah. Hurt by this trick befitting a malicious adīb, al-Turk composed al-Qadiyya in response. Before the news could spread, he recited his maqāma upon the, quote, dirty ears of his erstwhile friends, who here and elsewhere he refers to as his sons. This maqāma, as I will discuss in detail below, if I have the time, is a vehicle for the author to articulate two complementary processes, punishment and forgiveness. What we find is a homology between the cyclical nature of political alliances, as Osama Makdisi describes in the historical accounts of sovereignty in Mount Lebanon, and the process by which friendship comes into and is drawn out of crisis. As we already know from studies of the classical maqāma, these texts are performative in the sense that they demonstrate the author's eloquence and erudition through the exchanges between his characters. But as these initial examples suggest, they are also performative in another sense. While at times these maqāmāt represent past and present realities, at others they influence and even dictate the behavior of the audience, reinforcing my sense that their literary or formal qualities cannot be studied in isolation. Reconstructing the function of adab within the social world is especially important given Niqūlā al-Turk's position in history. Much might be said about the analytical value of reading his works diachronically, that is, comparing the formal features of his 11 maqāmāt to the features of the canonical maqāma collections of Badi' al-Zaman and his successors, most notably al-Hariri of Basra. But here, in addition to seeing al-Turk at the end of a long and distinguished literary history, we should recognize that he was writing decades before the Nahda, at least the Nahda as a self-conscious socio-political phenomenon of the mid to late 19th century. In this way, perhaps, his diwan lies beyond what the German philosopher Reinhard Koselleck calls a plane of historicity. For Koselleck, a plane of historicity is a shared set of understandings and experiences of temporality, not only including the past, but also the future. Such a conception is quite helpful for thinking about the notions of progress and reform, which are themselves claims about both the past and the future that distinguished the Nahda from the preceding period. The maqāma, in its own modest way, presents us with an opportunity to come to know aspects of the early 19th century in its own terms, rather than in the dismissive terms of later generations of intellectuals, including European philologists, who saw the maqāma as an exemplary manifestation of the cultural decline and intellectual stagnation of the pre-Nahda world. Thinking dialectically about adab and the adīb can help us to reconstruct this pre-Nahda world. First of all, al-Turk was writing for an audience of patrons and peers for whom he frequently recited his work face to face, and whose reactions his words were carefully tailored to elicit. This audience is radically different from the reading public of the literary journals that spread in earnest in the 1860s and 1870s, even if, as Elizabeth Holt and others have observed, a given copy of a newspaper or a journal circulated among friends, co-workers, and family, and was frequently read aloud, an author such as Ahmed Faris al-Shidyak or Muhammad al-Muwaylahi was no longer composing for an immediate audience of associates and friends, but for an abstract, imagined audience of journal and newspaper readers in far-off places at future times. The audience is also a market for a work of adab. It both consumes and evaluates the work. Al-Turk's maqāmāt were not commodities, or perhaps were not only commodities with a fixed value. On the contrary, many of them were designed to negotiate their own value by making demands on their audience, especially when that audience was a powerful and wealthy patron. Such an economic structure might be productively contrasted to the frequent reminders, requests, and pleas that the publisher Khalil al-Khoury included in the pages of Hadiqat al-Akhbar just a few decades later, as my colleague Ziad Dalal recently brought to my attention. Furthermore, the maqāma was not only a classical tradition in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but a living genre in which a number of al-Turk's immediate predecessors, contemporaries, and successors wrote. It was not stagnant, decadent, or in decline. Consider, for instance, Murtada Zubidi, the author of the famous 18th century lexicon Taj al-Arus. He composed at least 9 maqāmāt in the last decades of the 18th century. One survives in manuscript form, composed but never delivered to the sheikh of the Hawara tribe in Upper Egypt, notably in gratitude for the latter's hospitality. Likewise, both Hassan al-Attar and his student, Rifa'a al-Tahtawi, composed maqāmāt. While one of al-Attar's maqāmāt was published, and Sabri Hafiz claims there are others in manuscript form, al-Tahtawi's maqāmāt were never committed to paper. Traces of them, however, can be found in his writings. In his famous travelogue, Takhlis al-Ibriz fi Talkhis Paris, he mentions that he composed a maqāma extemporaneously, quote, while talking with some wits on his way from Alexandria to Marseille. Al-Tahtawi's offhand remark reminds us that the maqāma was not only a written activity, but an oral one as well. And while traces of this oral archive are preserved in writing, much of it is lost to us. What was true for Egyptian udaba was also true for those from Mount Lebanon. In addition to Niqūlā al-Turk, my larger dissertation project will look at maqāmāt composed by Ahmed al-Barbir, Hanaya al-Munayr, and Nasif al-Yaziji. There are others too: Yusuf al-Hani al-Ghaziri, Ibrahim al-Ahdab, and lest he be forgotten for even a moment, Ahmed Faris al-Shidyak. Al-Shidyak was not only placed the maqāma as the 13th chapter of each of the 4 volumes of his Asaq al-Asaq, but also published the strange and wonderful al-Maqāma al-Bakhshishiyya in al-Jawā'ib. In my own preliminary archival research, I have begun to find other maqāma texts from this period: a maqāma by the Damascus Sheikh Najib al-Attar, another entitled al-Maqāma al-Haditha by Raji al-Yaziji, the nephew or a nephew of Nasif, and most excitingly, I recently found what I believe to be a 7th manuscript copy of the maqāmāt of Niqūlā al-Turk, miscatalogued in an archive here in Beirut under the name Abu Nawadir, an error I think both the author and his characters would have greatly appreciated. Reading Adab and Adīb together, we can see the ways in which the maqāma was embedded in economic and social life. Al-Turk composed maqāmāt for material benefit, as well as to mark social events, express praise and condemnation, celebrate holidays, commemorate the visits of notables, embellish correspondence, entertain friends, and impress acquaintances, and express a range of feelings, from affection to disapproval, disappointment, and outrage. These were active, agentive roles for adab, roles which, perhaps, we can begin to see the Nahda as suppressing, even as its luminaries claim to be reforming and reviving the sphere of the literary. Embracing anthropologist Clifford Geertz's view that description is an interpretive act, let me now turn to a more detailed consideration of one or perhaps a few maqāmāt mentioned above, as a way to get at the meaning of adab as agent in its particularity. The first maqāma, and depending on time, the only maqāma I will discuss, is al-Maqāma al-Dayriyya, which in this 7th manuscript is actually called al-Maqāma al-Qamariyya. So when you put the 2 titles together, you suddenly have a very interesting location, being Dayr al-Qamar, which we'll return to in a moment. This maqāma was begun in April 1804, really just a few months after Niqūlā al-Turk returns from many years spent abroad in Egypt. It is the first episode in the print edition prepared by Fuad al-Bustani in 1949. It seems also to have been the first to be composed, given again that 1804 was the same year that al-Turk returned, blah, blah, blah. The narrative structure of this maqāma is elaborate. Al-Hazm, our narrator, opens the maqāma with a complaint that he has grown restless, malaltu, at home, and desires to travel, miltu ila safr. He praises the benefits of travel and warns against the dangers of staying at home, a theme that is both repeated and contradicted in al-Turk's other maqāmāt. Al-Hazm's own travels, condensed into a few lines, employ the long-established vocabulary of the rihla, including, for instance, his use of the verb atwi, recalling the opening line of the pre-Islamic poet al-Hutay'a's qasida of hardship while traveling in the barren desert, watawi thalathan, and so on. Al-Hazm, however, quickly leaves behind the generic imagery of towering mountains, taud, and valleys, wad, when he arrives at a place called Dayr. He meanders through its fields and climbs over its rocky hills until he happens upon a crowd. Curious, he draws it closer. In the middle of the crowd is a man. Although the narrator does not recognize him yet, this is our adīb, Abu Nawadir. Al-Hazm encounters Abu Nawadir in the midst of a narrative act, and he tells us about it. That is, he not only relates Abu Nawadir's story, but he gives us important details about how it was told. Here is my translation, which is number 3 in your packet. I saw someone amidst the crowd telling a story sweet to hear aloud. He told the people of his dream, helping them see what it might mean. Already, we have a string of related verbs for narration, including yusradu and yakosu. Intrigued, the narrator stays to listen. He says, and this is number 4, so I listened to him as he related what appeared to him, the strange things in his sleep he had seen, and the mixed-up jumble of his dreams. In staging acts of speaking and listening, this passage illustrates what anthropologist Karen Barber calls reflexivity, the unique capacity of linguistic texts, as opposed to other forms of human expression, such as dance or painting, to both employ and comment upon the language that is their shared medium. Abu Nawadir's dream begins with him witnessing a terrifying scene. I put this as number 5, although I'll just be summarizing it rather than struggling to translate in rhyming prose the Arabic here. This is what he sees. The hills tremble, the mountains convulse, violent winds and a great gale are whipped up, lightning crowds the sky and thunder grows louder and louder. The rivers overflow and the seas crash. This is the naturalistic imagery of the apocalypse, of the end of days, as Abu Nawadir himself hastens to say, فَنَامَتَ السَّلَامَ وَقَامَتَ الْقِيَامَةِ, or in my slightly playful translation, and peace began to doze while the resurrection rose. The dreamer finds himself suspended above the peaks and waves of a roiling sea, and the quick cadence of the sajā in these lines mirrors the rapidity of the unfolding events. As elsewhere in his diwan, al-Turk is not content to leave his characters' feelings implicit. In nearly every scene, he dedicates a line or two to explicitly articulating the character's affective state. Here, Abu Nawadir tells his audience that, quote, "The bonds of hope dissolved, and of my fate I grew resolved." For those interested in the history of emotion and its relationship to different conceptions of the self and formations of subjectivity, the maqāma offers intriguing possibilities. One might ask what facets of psychological internality the rawi, or narrator, of the maqāma and the subjects of an ostensibly modern novel share. But I digress. At this point, our narrator describes himself as adim al-najwa, or bereft of salvation. It is then that a shooting star, a Shihāb, breaks across the sky and stretches over the waves. The waters calm, the tempest settles, and al-Uqāb, a name for the constellation of Aquila, swoops down and carries the dreamer to the heavens. Saved from certain death, the adīb's shock and confusion begin to abate. He spies a light, perhaps a star, in the image of a lion, guiding the heavens and illuminating the sunrise. Who is this? Asks the dreaming Abu Nawadir. He is told in the passive voice, Qīlā, that this is Shihāb al-Afaq, the star of the horizons. This Shihāb, another transparent allusion to his patron, Bashīr al-Shihābi, is surrounded by brilliant stars and grips a deadly sword. After the anonymous voice details the awesome powers of this figure, Abu Nawadir decides to approach him and ask for assistance, all still within the narrative frame of the dream, to which our narrator is listening in the streets of Dayr al-Qamar, and which our author is reciting for Emir Bashīr himself. What the dreaming Abu Nawadir requests is a ma'wa. Here this term means both sanctuary